My name is Laura Mitchell. I'm 45 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worn a U.S. Navy uniform with pride. I didn't grow up with connections, favors, or anyone paving the way for me. I grew up in a modest house where reputation mattered more than truth, and appearances mattered more than effort. If you've ever been the person holding everything together while being treated like you were disposable, this story is for you. Because the moment I finally stopped shrinking for my family didn't come quietly. It came in front of everyone. I grew up in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other's business and judged it freely. Our two-story house looked respectable from the outside, even when money inside was tight. My mother cared deeply about how things appeared. She collected porcelain figurines and displayed them in a glass cabinet that dominated the living room. Every Sunday afternoon, after church, she dusted them carefully, like each one represented a piece of our family's worth. My father was no different. He drove an old sedan but waxed it every weekend until it shined like something newer, something better. To them, looking successful mattered more than being honest about struggle. I was the middle child. My older brother, Daniel, was loud and confident, the kind of kid who talked big even when results didn't back him up. My younger sister, Megan, had a natural talent for singing and a way of drawing attention without trying. I didn't have either of those gifts. What I had was reliability. I remembered deadlines. I helped cousins with homework at family gatherings. I stayed late to clean up when everyone else disappeared. My parents didn't praise that. They expected it. When relatives asked about us, Daniel was described as a future leader. Megan was called gifted. I was dependable. At 17, that word felt less like a compliment and more like a label that meant invisible. The idea of joining the Navy came during my senior year of high school, sitting in my guidance counselor's office and flipping through college brochures I couldn't afford. Military service wasn't something my family talked about, but the structure appealed to me. The idea that effort could matter more than image felt revolutionary. When I told my parents at dinner, my mother stared at me like I'd announced something embarrassing. She told neighbors it was just a phase. My father said women didn't belong on ships and that I'd be back home in 6 months. I didn't argue. I didn't need their approval. I needed a way out, and a way forward. The Navy gave me both. I worked hard, learned fast, and found something I'd never had at home. Clear expectations. Clear consequences. Respect earned through competence. While my friends posted photos from college parties, I learned navigation systems, leadership under pressure, and what it meant to be responsible for people other than myself. During my junior year of college, funded by military benefits, my parents ran into financial trouble. My father's hours were cut. My mother's part-time job barely covered groceries. Without being asked, I started sending money home. $200 here. $300 there. Enough to keep the lights on. Enough to make sure my sister could stay in school and my brother could plan his wedding without stress. They didn't thank me. But they stopped making jokes about my military phase, and I took that as progress. When I graduated and received my commission, my mother smiled at the ceremony. My father shook my hand and said, "Not bad." In our family, that counted as pride. My first deployment took me overseas for months. I sent half my paycheck home, even as I learned how to lead sailors twice my age. I believed I was building something solid, both for myself and for my family. But every phone call followed the same pattern. 10 minutes about my brother's job. 10 minutes about my sister's plans. Then a brief question about my Navy work, asked with the same tone someone might use to ask about a hobby. When I mentioned a promotion, my mother said, "That's nice," and immediately changed the subject. Over time, I noticed something else. At church, my parents talked proudly about Daniel's corporate milestones and Megan's engagement. When my name came up, they described me as still figuring things out. Friends nodded politely and moved on. My career didn't fit their story. A son in banking made sense. A daughter who taught or married did too. A daughter in uniform, unmarried, and independent made people uncomfortable, and my parents hated being uncomfortable. As the years passed, the money I sent home stopped being appreciated and started being expected. Roof repairs were mentioned casually. Car problems were implied as obligations. When I suggested budgeting or loans, my mother reminded me of everything they'd done raising me. Gratitude, to them, meant compliance. Meanwhile, my promotions became footnotes. When I earned a significant advancement, my parents suggested I not mention it too much at family events so I wouldn't make others uncomfortable. That was when I realized something painful. My success didn't embarrass them because it was small. It embarrassed them because it didn't fit their narrative. Family gatherings became exercises in quiet erasure. Conversations about my travels were redirected. Questions about my work were answered vaguely by my parents before I could speak. Relatives began offering advice I hadn't asked for, suggesting other careers, hinting that I was running out of time to settle down. My achievements were treated like detours instead of destinations. And slowly, I understood that my parents weren't simply indifferent. They were actively shaping how the family saw me, framing me as someone who hadn't quite made it, someone who still needed guidance. By the time my grandmother's 80th birthday reunion was planned, I already felt the distance. I requested leave specifically to attend. I told myself it was for her, not for my parents. I flew across the country hoping, maybe foolishly, that being surrounded by extended family might soften things. That maybe, just once, my parents would let my life speak for itself. I arrived early, hugged cousins I hadn't seen in years, and listened to stories over coffee. My grandmother pulled me close and whispered that she was proud of me. That moment alone almost made the trip worth it. As the afternoon went on, people shared updates. My brother announced a promotion and got applause. My sister talked about her new house and wedding plans. Smiles all around. When someone asked about me, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, but I waited. I wanted to believe the moment would pass without incident. I wanted to believe my parents wouldn't do what they'd been doing quietly for years, but louder. I was wrong. And what happened next didn't just hurt. It set the stage for everything that came after. And before I tell you exactly what they said, let me ask you this. Have you ever realized, in one sharp moment, that the people you were protecting would never protect you in return? Because that realization was about to change my life. By the time the reunion reached its busiest hour, the air was thick with barbecue smoke, laughter, and the easy confidence people wear when they believe they understand the roles everyone around them plays. I stood near the long folding tables with a plastic cup of sweet tea, listening more than talking, slipping back into the familiar position I'd learned growing up. Present, useful, but not central. Conversations floated past me about mortgages, schools, promotions, and weddings. These were the markers my family understood, the milestones that made sense to them. I told myself to stay calm, to enjoy my grandmother's day, to not expect anything different just because I'd hoped for it. As people drifted from group to group, my parents moved through the crowd with practiced ease, greeting relatives, laughing at the right moments, presenting the version of our family they preferred. I watched my mother touch arms, nod sympathetically, smile proudly when my brother's name came up. My father clapped backs and talked about hard work and responsibility. From a distance, they looked like the model parents they always wanted to be seen as. Up close, I felt the familiar separation, like I was watching actors perform a role I no longer belonged to. Eventually, the conversation turned toward me. It always did. An aunt I hadn't seen in years smiled warmly and said it was good to finally catch up. She asked what I'd been doing lately, her tone genuinely curious. For half a second, I considered answering myself. I could have spoken clearly, calmly, honestly. But before I had the chance, my mother stepped in, the way she always did. She laughed lightly and said, "Oh, Laura's still unemployed," like it was a running joke everyone should already know. The word landed hard. Still. As if this had been a long, ongoing problem. As if I hadn't spent years building a career defined by responsibility and service. There was a brief pause, the kind that happens when people sense something is off but don't quite know why. Then my father chimed in, smiling broadly, adding, "Maybe she can help wash dishes for once." Laughter followed. Real laughter. Not awkward or hesitant. Comfortable. Familiar. The kind that tells you a story has already been accepted. I stood there as the sound washed over me, my face hot, my hands suddenly too still. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, but I didn't move. I didn't smile. I didn't speak. In that moment, years of small dismissals snapped into focus. This wasn't a joke that had gone too far. It was the payoff. This was what they had been preparing the family for all along. The unemployed daughter. The one who hadn't figured it out. The safe target. I realized that defending myself would only make me look defensive, maybe even desperate. Correcting them would sound like bragging. Leaving would confirm their story. So I did what I'd been trained to do in difficult situations. I stayed composed. I said nothing. The conversation moved on, but the damage didn't. For the rest of the afternoon, people spoke to me differently. Their voices softened. They offered encouragement I hadn't asked for. They asked if I was thinking about going back to school or trying something new. Someone mentioned teaching. Another suggested administrative work. Each comment was delivered kindly, but each one reinforced the same message. They believed my parents. They believed I was lost. And my parents stood nearby, comfortable, validated, relieved. I excused myself and walked toward the farmhouse, my steps steady even though everything inside me felt unsteady. In the quiet of the kitchen, I leaned against the counter and stared out the window at the party continuing without me. No one followed at first. No one noticed I was gone. That hurt more than the laughter. I thought about the years I'd sent money home without being asked. The holidays I'd missed. The responsibilities I'd carried. All of it reduced to a punchline. A few minutes later, my cousin Mark came in quietly and closed the door behind him. He didn't say much at first. He just looked at me and shook his head. "That wasn't right," he said. The words were simple, but they broke something open. I told him, quietly, that this wasn't new. That my parents had been doing this for years, just never this openly. He nodded and admitted he'd heard them talk about me like I was struggling, like I needed help. He said he'd always thought it was strange, considering how often they mentioned money I sent or time I was away working. Hearing that confirmed what I already knew but hadn't wanted to fully accept. This wasn't misunderstanding. It was strategy. Standing there, something shifted. I felt a clarity I hadn't felt before. I saw my role in the family clearly for the first time. I wasn't the disappointment. I was the inconvenience. My independence made their story harder to tell. My success didn't reflect in the ways they valued, so they minimized it. And I had allowed it, thinking patience and loyalty would eventually earn respect. It hadn't. It never would. I took a breath, squared my shoulders, and walked back outside. I didn't confront them. I didn't correct anyone. I simply reclaimed my space by standing there calmly, letting the moment pass. My grandmother found me and squeezed my hand, her eyes searching my face. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She whispered that she loved me and that she was proud. That quiet support meant more than all the applause I hadn't received. As the afternoon wore on, I felt oddly detached, like I was watching the day from the outside. I knew something had changed, even if no one else realized it yet. I no longer felt the need to explain myself or prove anything. The truth existed whether they acknowledged it or not. And then, just as the sun dipped lower and conversations settled into their familiar rhythm again, a sound began to rise over the laughter. At first, it was distant, almost easy to ignore. But it grew louder, steadier, unmistakable. Heads turned. Voices trailed off. And the ground itself seemed to vibrate with what was approaching. That sound marked the moment when everything they thought they knew about me was about to collide with reality. And none of them were ready for what came next. The sound grew louder, chopping through the air until conversation became impossible. People shaded their eyes and looked toward the tree line as a military helicopter came into view, flying low and deliberate, not drifting past but coming straight toward us. Napkins lifted off tables. Children froze mid-run. The aircraft circled once, then descended onto the open stretch of grass beyond the farmhouse. The rotor wash flattened the lawn and sent smoke from the grill spiraling away. Whatever casual energy remained at the reunion vanished in seconds. This wasn't entertainment. This was official. I felt it before anyone said a word. Recognition. The kind that lives in your bones after years of service. This wasn't a mistake or a coincidence. When the helicopter touched down, a uniformed officer stepped out and walked toward me with purpose. People parted without realizing they were doing it. My parents stood frozen, expressions caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief. The officer stopped in front of me, saluted, and addressed me clearly enough for everyone to hear. "Ma'am. We need you at the Pentagon immediately." Silence fell hard. The kind that presses against your ears. My mother's hand flew to her chest. My father's face drained of color. A few relatives exchanged looks, trying to process what they'd just heard. The same people who had laughed minutes earlier now stared as if I had transformed into someone else entirely. I hadn't. They were just seeing me without the filter my parents had carefully maintained. "Yes, sir," I replied automatically, my voice steady, professional. He explained there was a priority situation. Transport was standing by. I requested 5 minutes to collect my things. He nodded. As I walked back toward the house, people stepped aside. No one spoke. I could hear whispers starting behind me, questions forming too late. In the guest room, I packed quickly, muscle memory taking over. This was familiar. The chaos. The urgency. The clarity of purpose. What felt surreal was the setting, not the mission. When I came back out, my grandmother reached for me. She didn't ask for explanations. She hugged me tightly and whispered that she had always been proud of me. That mattered. It mattered more than anything my parents could say in that moment. I walked toward the helicopter with the officer beside me, the rotors already spinning up again. My mother called my name, her voice thin and uncertain, but there was no time, and honestly, no words left for that moment. As the helicopter lifted off, I looked down at the gathering shrinking beneath us. Faces turned upward. A day that had been built on assumptions had collapsed under the weight of truth. By the time we banked away, the story my parents had been telling about me for years was gone. Not because I fought it, but because reality finally arrived uninvited. Weeks later, I learned what happened after I left. The reunion didn't recover. Conversations shifted from celebration to uncomfortable reflection. People asked questions my parents couldn't answer. How long had I been serving? What did I actually do? Why had they said I was unemployed? My parents withdrew, avoiding attention they once controlled so carefully. Relatives who had laughed now felt embarrassed. Some reached out quietly to apologize. Others stayed silent, unsure how to reconcile their behavior. My parents called weeks later. The conversation was awkward, cautious. My mother said there had been a misunderstanding. I told her there hadn't. There had been a choice. We talked longer than we ever had before, not emotionally, but honestly. I made it clear that things would change. I would no longer accept jokes, minimization, or silence in exchange for peace. Respect wasn't optional anymore. If they wanted a relationship with me, it would be based on truth. It took time. Real change always does. But something shifted permanently that day. I stopped trying to earn approval that only came when I made myself smaller. I stopped carrying responsibilities that were never acknowledged. I built boundaries where obligations used to be. And slowly, my parents began to adjust. Not perfectly. Not quickly. But genuinely. Years later, when I stood at a promotion ceremony surrounded by colleagues who knew my work and respected it, my parents were there. Watching. Quiet. Present. For the first time, they weren't trying to explain me away. They were simply listening. Learning. That was enough. I tell this story because I know how many people live inside versions of themselves designed to make others comfortable. How many carry families, workplaces, entire relationships, while being treated as invisible or replaceable. If that's you, hear this clearly. You don't owe anyone your silence. You don't owe anyone your diminishment. And the truth doesn't need permission to arrive. It always does. If this story resonated with you, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated or dismissed by the people closest to you? How did you handle it? Share your experience in the comments. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories about boundaries, self-respect, and standing tall without shouting, hit like, subscribe, and stay with me. You're not alone, and your story deserves to be told.